Hello, everybody. This is Ken Wilson calling you from London on a Sunday afternoon. What is it, the 94th week of lockdown, and some of us are trying to teach remotely. As usual, my deep, deep sympathies to those of you who are trying to teach a whole class remotely, where they're all individually watching you through their own computers. I have some experience of it this week. For the last couple of weeks, I've been trying to do some tutoring with my grandchildren. This is my daughter Sadie, who every day reads to me online, and then she puts the book down and we discuss what the contents of the book, and it works pretty well for about 45 minutes, and then she runs away to play with something else. And this is my grandson, Morris, who is Sadie's cousin, and he's also terrific as an online tutee, but he does sometimes want to try out the effects on his mother's phone, as you can see from this, and every so often he'll say, "Just a minute," and he takes me off to show me his goldfish. So I do understand that the problems associated with remote teaching are a lot to do with the location of the learner. Okay, so today my talk is called 7 Things I Think I Know About Teaching and Learning. Like you, I've had a lot of opportunity to reflect on all kinds of things this last few weeks, work, life in general. And I've been thinking a lot about the things that we accept as normal about teaching these days. I appreciate that I've been teaching a lot longer than most of you, in fact, all of you. I first started teaching in 1968, which is 52 years ago, before you were born. So my experience is rather different. My first experience as a teacher is rather different from your experience now. My first teaching job was in this rather wonderful city. Now, those of you who've been to one of my talks will know that I like it when people shout out answers and not worry if they're right or wrong. When I'm doing a talk or a workshop, I try during the course of the hour or hour and a half or 3 hours to engender a sensation in the participants that they can say what they want, they can shout things out, and not worry if it's right or wrong. In fact, I encourage mistakes because, as we know, mistakes are a fundamental part of learning. And if you enjoy your mistakes, it's much better than being horrified or shocked or rendered speechless by your mistakes. So here's an example. This is the city in the south of Europe somewhere that I started working 52 years ago as an English teacher. Shout out the name if you think you know it, and shout it out now. And who got it right? And it doesn't matter if you got it right or got it wrong. I hope you enjoyed the experience of all shouting together in class. So I started teaching 52 years ago in Seville, in the south of Spain, and my classroom looked a little bit like this. In fact, that classroom looks as if nobody's been there for 52 years. I had a blackboard, I had chalk, I had no audio, we had a book with no tape that went with it, and it was okay. I enjoyed it. It was an interesting time. Then I went to work in London, and suddenly we had technology. This is what the technology looked like. That was a language laboratory, and to be honest, it was a nightmare, both for the teacher and the students. It took a long time to set up. There were these reel-to-reel tapes. As you can see, everybody in their booths had individual reel-to-reel tapes, no video, of course. And the only thing that they could practice was some stimulus and response, quite behaviorist sort of stuff, really not terribly helpful. And I think certainly most of my students preferred being in the classroom to being in the language laboratory. But of course, technology now is much more exciting, much more hands-on, much more useful. So maybe some of you actually work in a classroom that looks like this. Possibly you do. So of course, your personal experience of day-to-day teaching in a classroom is very different from mine. And of course, another huge difference is the technology that your students have in their pockets. Look at that, stuff that we couldn't imagine having even 10, 15 years ago. And the first interesting thing about this technology is that if you ask them not to use it in class, they get kind of very anxious. They want to look at their phones every 5 minutes, and they get withdrawal symptoms. Exactly the same as if you used to allow your students to smoke in class, God forbid, and you stop them smoking. Very similar problems of withdrawal, which suggests it might be a good idea to use the technology in the classroom, much better for them than smoking. And of course, you get things like this. You get cartoons about education. Now, I really find this cartoon quite offensive. I mean, the teacher, the idea that teachers look like that with her hairstyle going back to the 19th century, and more importantly for now, her assignments which don't resonate with modern students. And he says, of course, if you follow me on Twitter, you'd know. I find this cartoon offensive for a number of different reasons, not least because it suggests a disconnect between teachers and students, which I don't think exists. I think there's a terrific connect between teachers and students these days, because you have to connect with your students some way or other. But what I want to talk about are things that underlie the nature of being in a classroom with a class, what I call classroom realities. And the reason I've been thinking about this is that I've been to some talks sometimes, and I've been to some meetings with publishers, and at the back of my mind, I have this feeling that what we're talking about is something that's fundamentally not quite right. Now, I'll say at this moment, I hope that you disagree with some of the things that I have to say. If you do agree or disagree or have any other thoughts, can you please write them on my Facebook page, not on the YouTube page that this video will appear on. I'd love to hear what you think. And these are just my personal thoughts. And if you disagree with them completely, it doesn't mean that I'm right and you're wrong. It could be completely the opposite. Everything is about your situation with your students. But I'm just going to say a few things that I think and see what you think about them. So my first thought, and this is my first thought, most students are in class because they have to be. If you've been to one of my talks before, you'll know that I like talking about monolingual groups of students and non-native speaker teachers. I really don't like the distinction between native speaker teachers and non-native speaker teachers. But the fact is, I've been writing materials for the last 25 or 30 years. Most of the books that I've written have been aimed at monolingual groups of students studying in their own country. They often look like this, okay? And we always talk about motivation. Now, I'm thinking about state school students, okay, not private. If you work in a private school, I hope some of this resonates with you as well. But my instinctive feeling is that the only thing that motivates students in public schools, in state schools, public schools, US meaning, is the fact that they have to be there and they'll get into trouble if they're not. But we often hear people talking about motivation, and you hear the most extraordinary things. And I went to a talk a couple of years ago, a wonderful talk given by a terrific speaker. But she said that the way to motivate your English language students is to tell them that English is important. English is important. And she put the usual statistics on the board. Okay? These things are all true. But as a motivational factor, I'm not sure that they resonate with some students. In fact, I think some students might find this insulting because other languages are also important. And certainly, if I was a native speaker of Spanish or Arabic or Russian or Chinese or Portuguese, I would consider it quite insulting to suggest that English is somehow more important than my language, okay? More important than my language. So when it comes to motivating students, I don't think saying that English is incredibly important works. And I remember I'm talking about teenagers really who are in a classroom where they're required to be there. How do you motivate 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old students who are in a classroom because they have to be there? I don't think whatever language that they speak, the way to say it is English is more important than your language, which however you look at it is what that kind of statistic and that kind of motivation is saying. So what motivates the kind of students I'm talking about? Teenagers in class because they have to be there. Well, a very good book to go to, much more interesting than anything I have to say, is Motivational Strategies in the Language Classroom by Zoltán Dernier, Hungarian academic who works in the United Kingdom. And I've read this book and I've looked at other sources of research research that asks students specifically, what is it you like about your class? What is it that makes you want to go back to class? And it's not just, in the research I've read is not just about English learners, about learners of all subjects. And as far as I can see, it comes down to 5 different motivational factors. The first one, I will leave until the end. The second, the third, the fourth, and the fifth are pretty obvious things, really. The teacher has a good relationship with us. Makes sense. Teachers who walk in and have a kind of icy stare and want to frighten their students into submission, you're not going to get a lot of motivation out of that. I like the third and the fourth one. I like all of them. She enjoys our progress and success. It's all about attitude. If you still have paper homework, I presume some of you do, and you give the paper homework back, and it's better than last time, then you say, hey, well done, that's better than last time. Not, okay, it was better than last time. That sounds like a criticism, okay? Little moments like that about the relationship that you have with your students that motivates them to want to come back to your class. But what is this special number one motivational factor? The motivational factor is this. The teacher is enthusiastic. The teacher is enthusiastic, okay? I want to show you a bit more research from this woman here. Her name is Dee Dee Wilson. Oh, she has the same name as me. Oh, it's my wife. That's why she has the same name as me. Dee Dee, who did her master's in applied linguistics, and her thesis was about perceptions of students who have a native speaker and a non-native speaker teacher at the same time. Not at the same time in the same room, but during the same course. And I found this wonderful quotation from a 16-year-old Romanian student in an immersion school. And here it is. I'd rather have an enthusiastic teacher who isn't a native speaker, even if her English isn't perfect, than a native speaker who isn't very enthusiastic. I want you all to look at the implications of that. She may be the only one who thinks that. I don't think she is. But for you non-native speaker teachers, you should feel very, very happy about this, because it's your enthusiasm for your work that's more important to your learners than the fact that you're not a native speaker. Native speakers are no big deal. This is my constant message. Native speaker teachers are okay. Some of them are brilliant teachers, but they're no big deal and no different and no more special than non-native speaker teachers. There is a built-in problem here, of course, which is that it means we have to get up in the morning going, yay, I'm an English teacher, how lucky am I? Do we feel like this when we get up in the morning? I mean, like in the normal circumstances when we're going to class? I don't think most of us do. I think most of us feel more like this. Or indeed, I love this version of the cartoon. Okay? So there's this feeling that enthusiasm is the key, but it is really quite hard to be enthusiastic at all times. So what I can just recommend, my message to you is simply this. Just try to be enthusiastic when you start a class. Walk in with a big, hello everybody, let's do something today. Then you can calm down. Just start with some enthusiasm. Well, let's go back to this main situation of what I've been talking about. Most English students, most students of every subject, but let's talk about the language ones, are in class in their own country. The vast majority, maybe more than 90–95% of students who study English are in a class in their own country with people who speak the same language, being taught by somebody who speaks their language, okay? Really, very importantly, most of them have zero opportunity to leave that situation. Their chances of actually moving to another place, working or living in another place, or just traveling there as a tourist are very, very limited. The number of people who have the opportunity to travel, well, it's nobody at the moment, but in normal circumstances, the number of people who have the opportunity to travel to other countries is very, very limited. So this is why I think the importance of English is not sufficient motivation. It's not sufficient motivation, and also, and this is where my other thinking has been coming in, as you'll see in a moment, it's really important that teaching materials should recognize this reality. Teaching materials should recognize the reality that most students who use them are not in a position to talk to English people on a regular basis or indeed travel to an English-speaking country. And I think if you have that in your mind, when you're looking at the materials that you use, you may see them in a different light. I went to a wonderful conference in Thessaloniki, Greece, probably about 10 years ago now. And a very good speaker was doing a workshop on listening. And in his listening workshop, he was actually talking about a book that he'd written himself, a very good book. This guy's a very good writer. But he played a wonderful tape, an authentic tape of two of his students. One was Portuguese, one was Japanese, and they were talking about local transportation systems in their own countries. He lived in Lisbon, she lived in Tokyo. And I hope you don't mind me just slightly imitating what this tape sounded like. The girl from Japan said, "Oh, we have local interchange system, transport interchange system." And the Portuguese boy said, "What does that mean?" She said, "You can get off the bus and get on the train." He says, "Oh, we have things like that in Lisbon too." It was a wonderful piece of authentic listening, and the students would really enjoy listening to it. However, then the presenter said, in pairs, tell your students to compare and contrast their local transportation systems. There was silence for a moment in the room until one of the teachers said rather timidly, and I would have said it if he hadn't, "All my students live in Thessaloniki." And at this point, the author of this material suddenly went, "Yes, of course." And this activity had made it into a book, which clearly works if you've got an international group of students. If you're working in the UK or New Zealand or the United States or somewhere, and your students are from different nationalities, then that's a wonderful pair work activity. It doesn't work if all your students live in the same city. And if you look at your materials quite carefully, you'll occasionally see things like that, which have slipped through the net and simply do not work with a monolingual group of students who live in their own town. But there's more than things like that. There's activities like this one. Imagine you have visitors from other countries and you want to show them famous places in your city. That's not so simple. Maybe you might think that's okay. But I find that just a little bit, is this going to happen? Is it really going to happen? You know, I'd rather the activity was you're Skyping with somebody from another country and telling them about your country with the idea of taking people around. And here's another one. I saw this one being done in class with a bunch of students who really hadn't got the means to go anywhere. And they really weren't interested in answering this question. If you could go anywhere in the world, where would you like to go? So these are the kind of activities which really, I mean, you might disagree with me. I don't mind if you disagree. Write on my Facebook page if you disagree with this. These are the kinds of activities which really don't work terribly well with monolingual groups. Okay, that was my first one. Remembering that students are normally in a situation where they're in their own country. The second one, my second thought, this is what I think I know. This one is very controversial, and I've argued with lots of teachers about this. But I'll just go back to my personal working situation. For the last 25 or 30 years, I've been writing course material. I've written 15 series of course books. I think I'm getting the idea how to do it finally after 30 years. And during that time, I've sat at the back of the class. This will be important later on as well. I sit at the back of the class watching other people teach. And now we move to the publishers. When you're writing a book these days, publishers say, don't forget personalization, every page, personalization on every page, okay? Not a bad idea generally, okay? However, and I'm saying this very carefully, I've watched lots of classes now of teenagers when there've been certain kinds of questions being asked. And when there's questions like this, what do your parents do? How many brothers and sisters have you got? What do you do in your free time? What do you want to do when you leave school? I've seen teenagers who are quite reluctant to answer these questions, sometimes for obvious reasons. What do your parents do? If you only live with one parent, that's kind of slightly embarrassing. How many brothers and sisters have you got? I was in class once when this boy didn't really want to answer. It turned out he had 7 brothers and sisters, and everybody else in the class had like 1 or 2. Now, some people say teenagers want to be different. Teenagers want to be the same as their peer group. So anything that makes them come across as a little bit different, they feel a bit embarrassed about. What do you do in your free time? Imagine you're the one kid in the class who doesn't have a computer at home. So everybody else is saying, I go online, I do this. And what do you do? Oh, and what do you want to do when you leave school? The problem with that one is not that people haven't got ambitions, is that they have got ambitions, but some of their ambitions, they're so personal and they think that the rest of the class will find them funny, but they don't want to talk about them. And I've seen this time and time again, and it's a great pity because the great change in English language teaching materials since I started work writing them has been this attempt to personalize the material, to make it relevant to the students' own lives. And then suddenly you see that maybe it's a little bit too personal for this particular group. I'm not talking about adults working in a private language school. I'm talking about teenagers in a state school. So what else can we do? What are better questions? Well, although it's taking it down to pop culture, asking them which of two local bands is better. Let them argue about that all the time, okay? Or which is the best football team in Europe? Some of them in the class won't want to talk about that, but if they do. And little bits of factual information that they can come up with. Who holds the world record for the 100 meters? Or one extraordinary question I saw being answered was, who was the last emperor of China? Now, I'll just talk about that one in a moment. Let's go to the world record for the 100 meters. I'm going to, here's the question. So I want you to all to shout the answer at the screen. Who holds the world record for the 100 meters? Shout the answer now. And there she is. I didn't say it was a man. Does it say man who holds the men's world record for the 100 meters? This woman is extraordinary. Sadly, she passed away at a very young age, but she broke the world record for the 100 and 200 meters in 1988, and her world records are still standing. So that's an extraordinary achievement, okay? So I think her achievement is more extraordinary than her male equivalent, who of course is, you can shout his name at the screen now. It is of course Usain Bolt. We're going back to the Emperor of China. There was a reading text in class I was watching once, and what was interesting was that the teacher was about to say, and you probably don't know this, but the last Emperor of China, and somebody said it in the audience, in the class. His name is Puyi. And the teacher was astonished, quite rightly astonished. I was astonished as well. But he gave me another thought, which I'll come up with in a moment, okay? But this is the last emperor of China, and extraordinarily, he became emperor at the age of 2 years and 10 months. And he was emperor just for 4 years until he was nearly 6 years old, 7 years old. So I just want to talk a bit about this, about nuggets of information which your students have themselves. And I've got a thing from a personal experience I want to tell you about. As part of my research into a book that I was writing, I went to this wonderful city. You won't be able to recognize it. You can have a guess. Just shout out, have a guess. Shout at the screen. Again, doesn't matter if you're right or wrong, okay? Where could this city be, okay? And I'll tell you, it's a place called Lviv in Ukraine. Some of you may pronounce it Lvov, but the people who live in Lviv pronounce it Lviv if they're Ukrainian speakers. And I was there to do research for a book that I was writing. I'll never forget, it was a Thursday morning, it was raining, and the thing that, Lviv is an absolutely beautiful city. But in those days, this is about 20 years ago now, they had a bit of a problem with power, and there were occasional unexpected power cuts. So I walked into this wonderful old building, beautiful, beautiful old school, needed a bit of repair, but it was a very grand building. Walked in, and a woman came up to me and said, "Good morning, Mr. Wilson, I'm the head teacher of the school." And she shook hands with me, and all the lights went out. I thought, oh, that was a clever trick. How do you do that? She went, "Oh dear, a power cut." Now, upstairs in this school was a woman teacher who'd been told a week before, "You are going to have an Englishman watching your class next week." The publisher had rung the school and said, "Can we bring an English teacher?" And they said, "Yes, okay." And then this poor woman was told, and she spent a week. And you know, I'm quite tall, and I'm a native speaker, and I'm supposed to be an expert. It must be terrifying for teachers to see me walking into the classroom, which is why I always try and be very good. I sit at the back and I smile all the time. I never take notes. I think taking notes when you're watching a class, the teacher will always presume you're writing something that they're doing wrong. So I just sit there and I smile and I take notes. In this case, we went upstairs, we walked on the corridor, I looked through the window. All the children had taken a candle out of their desk and lit the candle, because this happened so often, so they could see what they were writing. It was quite dark inside this school. And at the end of the corridor, we opened the door, and a tall woman, almost as tall as me, was standing there holding a cassette. And when she saw me walk in, she didn't say, "Oh, good morning, Mr. Wilson, how are you?" She went, "Yeah!" like that, because her plan for the lesson had gone out of the window because of the power cut. I'm not stupid. I could see that was happening. So I walked in and I walked up to this woman and I whispered in her ear, "Don't worry. If you run out of things to do, I can take the rest of the class for you." She said, "Thank you so much." And she turned to the class, who were 14 years old, and said, "This is Mr. Wilson. He's your teacher." And she sat down. So I had 45 minutes with these wonderful 14-year-old Ukrainian students. So I stood there going, nowadays I'm prepared for things like that. I go in to a class that I've been asked to watch with well, I asked if I can take some of the class anyway. So I have some activities up my sleeve, but I had nothing prepared. So I looked at this lovely bunch of students and I said, "Hello, I'm writing a book. And I'm writing a book which I hope you will use next year, the year after that, perhaps, when you're learning English." So I thought, I'll ask them about the English-speaking world. Tell me, who in the English-speaking world do you know something about? Who in the world of English, American, British, Australian, something like that, who do you know something about? And the student said immediately, Queen Elizabeth I. And I said, Queen Elizabeth I, don't you mean Queen Elizabeth II, this one? He said, no, Queen Elizabeth I, 1558 to 1603, he knew her dates. I was astonished. The teacher was astonished. Everybody else was astonished. And he said rather defensively, "I like history." Not only does he like history, one of his parents, it turned out, was a history teacher. And from a very early age, all the books in his house had been full of, and especially books with color photographs, had been full of images of kings and queens and emperors of China as well, although he wasn't the one who said the emperor of China. Presidents of the United States. What a wonderful fountain of information for you, okay? I mentioned it to the teacher afterwards when we had a cup of coffee. And I said, "That's great." She said, "I didn't know." I said, "Well, now you know. Anytime you have a question about history, you can ask him." She said, "I don't think we're supposed to do that." Which brings us to another problem about the teacher being the fountain of all information. Not a great idea. If you've got 30 students in your class, whether they're 5 years old or 25 years old or 55 years old, they all know something. You probably know more about English than they do, but they know about lots of other stuff that you don't know, including, for example, monarchs and emperors of China. So always allow for people in the class to provide some of the content. So the message, key into what they already know about and give them the chance to tell you. They won't tell you straight away, but just little by little, allow your students to come up with things that they know something about. Okay, what's my third thought? Some of you may already know this is one of my particular thoughts. I've written about it. I've talked about it in conferences, and I'll try and explain what I mean by this, okay? Remember I said earlier, when I'm watching a class, I usually sit at the back of the class. And the moment I really, really dread more than anything is when the teacher says, "Open your books at page 36 and look at the reading text," because I know what's going to happen next in so many classes. The teacher asks a student on the front row to read the first sentence, and from the back I hear something like, that's all I can hear. I haven't got a book, and I'm sitting at the back. "Thank you," says the teacher, and asks the student next to that student to read the second sentence. I can't hear anything, nor can the rest of the class, but they aren't listening. They are simply reading the rest of the text. In some cases, they know how it works. They've worked out that they will be required to read the 7th sentence, so they're concentrating on the 7th sentence. I can see no value at all in this kind of reading aloud. There are activities where students can read to each other instructions, but I see no possible value to this kind of reading. But I have to say that it happens so often. This is why I feel I need to say something about it, okay? Now, I often ask teachers after, that was very interesting about the reading aloud. Can you tell me why you do that? And I never tell people they're doing wrong. I would never tell any teacher they're doing anything wrong. If what you do with your students is what you've built up, what you feel comfortable with, all I'm thinking, maybe we need to rethink 1 or 2 things. And there are certain reasons that the teachers give why they think reading aloud is a good idea. They say students love it. They say reading aloud brings the text to life. This is my favorite. If they didn't read, they wouldn't have any speaking practice. It's good pronunciation practice, it gets worse. If they don't read aloud, the class goes very quiet. Well, that's because it's a reading activity. I'll just leave that one out. Students love it. When teachers say students love it, what they normally mean is I love it. And why teachers love it usually is that it means that they've got 10, 15 minutes to the lesson, that they know what's going to happen. And that's fine. It's important that not all of your lesson is chaos or unpredictable or improvised. We don't want that to happen. We'd like some of it to be improvised. It's nice when you know that a 10-minute section, 15-minute section, something particular is going to happen. But I do not believe that students love it. I do not believe that reading aloud brings the text to life. And the third one is the worst of all. If they didn't read, they wouldn't have any speaking practice. Reading aloud is not speaking practice. Reading aloud is reading aloud, a very particular sub-skill of reading. It's a sub-skill that very, very few people in this world do well, particularly think people like newsreaders. Newsreaders take years to learn how to read aloud well from a text that's in front of them, I mean. And as for good pronunciation practice, what I found most extraordinary is if I get a chance to talk to students after this activity, I find their pronunciation is much better in spoken language than it was when I heard them reading from the book. So if I do nothing else today, I want you to think about if you ever ask your students to open their books and read a line each while you're doing it. If you really like doing that, then here's a couple of ideas. This is a better scenario. Let's assume we're talking about, it's the day of a particular text we've arrived at. This is what I think you should do. There are people in the class who can read well. Bring them out to the front and let them share the reading, but everybody else listens with their books closed. The rest of the class listens to it, and people say, but then it becomes a listening activity. Yes, that's right, it does. The reading activities will surround it in some way, okay? And it's very important to offer the students who are listening the chance to ask for a repeat of a word or something like that. I still don't like this particularly, but if you really insist on reading a text aloud when you first arrive at that text in a course book, then I would suggest this as an alternative. So I'll pause for a minute so that you can take a photograph of that with your phone. But I have a better idea anyway. I'm personally not a great fan of this stuff being read aloud. What I think is a good idea, excuse me, is when you start reading a book, let's say you have 24 students in your class, okay? Then you choose a number, 8 in this case, reading text, enough for 1 for every 3 students, okay? And you designate 3 students who are in charge of the reading text in Unit 2, Unit 4, Unit 7, Unit 8, 9, whatever. You choose 8, not all of them. And they are now responsible for that, okay? And they can, when the class reaches that unit and that reading text, they are in charge. You give responsibility to them, okay? They can do whatever they want, but they've got to check it in advance for vocabulary, and they come and ask you about any possible difficulties. You don't ask them to teach new grammar, and I don't think that should be what the text is doing anyway. okay? But ask them to check the vocabulary, pre-teach it if they want, translate it if they want. Shocking thought, translation in the classroom. I'm going to talk about that a bit later. And from the moment, and this is, I'm very much in favor, again, something I'll talk about a bit more later, if teachers devolving responsibility, sitting back while students do take care of what's happening in the classroom. You all work too hard. That's one of my later points. Now, I've written about this on my blog. Reading aloud in class is a complete waste of time. That's the link to my blog. I should be able to do those code things, but I can't. So this is a link, a tiny URL link to the article in my blog, if you want to read more of my thoughts about reading aloud. So it's tiny URL Y3584U4F. Take a photograph of that. So the message is, just think again about how to deal with reading texts. Okay, time to move on. Number 4, this is my favorite. It's tied up in that little sentence. English is tough stuff. I want to talk a bit about spelling and pronunciation. And as usual at this point, I apologize to all non-native speaker teachers for the ridiculous disconnect that exists between the spoken word and the written word in English. It's ridiculous. How did English get to be like this? Just look at this extract from a poem. I'm going to start reading it in a moment. You can read along with me if you want. I'll let you just read the first few lines first. Okay, I'm going to read it. Here we go. Just compare heart, beard, and herd. How about that? E-A-R in 3 different words, pronounced differently every time. R, ear, and Dies and diet, lord and word. But be careful how you speak. Say break and stake, but beak and weak. The next line is about stress. This man is a vicar, but he smokes a cigar. You can go to war, but you won't go far. Try to say shoes, does, and goes. Then say no, now, and knows. River, rival, oh my God, look at these. Tomb, bomb, comb. Doll and droll, some and home. I wonder if any of you know this poem. It's a very long poem. It's called The Chaos, and it was written by a Dutch priest who lived in the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. I think it's funny that he's so good at all that, and yet he didn't know that chaos is an abstract noun that probably doesn't need a definite article. Anyway, so follow that link. The thing is, those of you like you who enjoyed English at school, were good at English, you probably find this stuff really great and fun and interesting and a challenge, and that's wonderful. The more this language that you've chosen to teach is a challenge for you in private when you're doing your studying, the better. But think about your poor students, and what's been worrying me most about published material recently is the fact that we encourage students to see words on the page before they have to pronounce them. That's the first problem. And the secondary problem, which I'll talk about a bit later, is the number of new words that we're allowing to be on the page of new units. And I'm particularly talking about elementary level, beginners, elementary, early intermediate level. I think words at this level are a real challenge for students. And I really want to go back to the old idea that people should hear words and try and pronounce them before they see them. I mean, look at the numbers, the first numbers. How difficult can this language get after this? 1, where is the W sound in that? O-N-E, only 1. How do we get the W sound? 2, now there's the W sound, but we're not using it. 3, 4, 5, okay, those aren't too difficult, but very soon in your life, you will find out a whole other set of words that look very similar. Only, now that makes more sense. It's connected with 1, obviously, but it's pronounced without the W sound. Twice connected with 2, but the W appears in there. Now what's happening here? 3 has a voiceless th, but this is voiced. 4, hour, oh no, the same letters but pronounced completely differently. 5 and give. How hard can this be? And then of course a whole bunch of other words comes up, taking you back to the original. Once, again, the only other word where that W exists at the beginning of that word. There's nothing else where there's a TW where the W isn't pronounced. Yet more voiceless sounds think, and yet more words that are pronounced the same way as the numbers. 4, poor, 5, died. All I'm saying is that for some of your students, it's better to hear early on these words. Hear them first before you have to pronounce them, okay? It's a nightmare of pronunciation. As I say, most people like you who've chosen to study this language find this a great challenge and a great, I find it interesting. And when you look into the origins of these words, why are they pronounced this different way, and where the word came from, it's often to do with the roots of the words that cause the pronunciation. Fascinating stuff, but not easy when you're teaching elementary students. So the message is, I think you should allow your students to hear certain words, your elementary students, to hear certain words before they read them. I would not recommend people seeing the word one, O-N-E, and then saying, there's the word, go home and learn it. One, two, three. Impossible. I want to say a little bit more about teaching vocabulary. I mentioned it earlier. I'm a little bit worried that we are putting more words onto the page of books than we used to. The word I use is bloated. Bloated is like a body that's full of water when it's drowning, okay? And I find that since we started, when I started my first course book that I wrote in 1990, and we talked about numbers of new words per unit, and we agreed on 5. 5 new words per unit for a beginner's course. And now people are talking about 15, 20 new words per unit, 15 or 20 new words at elementary level. And then we talk about how we teach it. We have defining activities, we have predicting activities, matching activities, categorizing, and one which is not used hardly enough, translating. Why is it not used enough? Because the publishers are very clever. Why am I saying this? I'm a published author. But it does annoy me a little bit that publishers avoid the translation option in books. Translations are a really useful skill. They avoid it so that books can be sold in more than one country. When I was studying German at night school, the instructional language was in English, and there were translation options in the book. It was really helpful. I don't think there's enough translation options, and it's partly because the publishers want to publish books for different nationalities. So if you're a teacher and you worry there's a lack of translation option in the book, by all means provide more. Translation is a very useful skill. But I want to talk a bit more about categorizing. More and more, I see the presentation of new vocabulary is a word box, a box full of words, decontextualized, they're just sitting there, but with this categorizing requirement that gives it some kind of meaning, okay? And you get something like this. The words are transport words, and put the following words into these categories: means of transport, transport places, people involved in transport, and travel documents. Are you ready, teachers? You're good at this kind of thing. I'm going to show you a bunch of words. I'm going to give you 5 minutes to put them into those categories. Are you ready? Here are the words. Go on. What's the problem? I know it's in Hungarian, but that's how those word boxes look to some of your students. Just a mass of things and decontextualized, no images to go with them, no context, no collocations. I do not think this is a sensible way to present language. I'm just going to leave it there as a thought. Okay, that's my main thought about presenting and teaching new vocabulary. Okay, not much more. Almost time to go make a cup of tea. My 5th thought. This is about the layout of your classroom. Sitting in rows is bad for your English. As I told you earlier, I tend to sit at the back of the class. I've noticed that the people who join me at the back of the class tend to be young men, teenagers who are leaning against the back wall, and they are definitely too cool for school. They're nervous. They're nervous. They don't want to get involved in any of it. That kind of classroom that looks like that is not good for a place to learn a language. Maybe other subjects, okay, but in terms of learning a language, it's not a great idea. Does anybody know this painting? Shout out if you know the artist. Go on, shout out. He's from Belgium. His name is Magritte. And the painting is called The view from the back of the class. No, it's not. It's not called the view from the back of the class. It's called la reproduction est interdite or something. Reproduction is prohibited. But I think Magritte used to sit at the back of the class and feel frustrated. Okay, if your class looks like that, maybe time to change. Try and change the desks so they look like that, so people can see each other's faces. Or put them at desks, at separate tables, so they can see each other's faces around the table. If they're young, let them sit on the floor. Some students prefer sitting on the floor, and if you can, take them out somewhere different. Sit them in a park somewhere. This is after lockdown. Yeah, this looks like another world, doesn't it, at the moment? Okay, I really think you've got to think about the way your classroom is laid out. Think about the layout of your classroom. I'm almost finished, not much else to talk about, okay? Number 6, wheels and spider's webs. What on earth does that mean? Well, what I think is this, that a lot of classes resemble a wheel. The teacher is at the middle part is called the hub, and the teacher has a relationship, strong relationship with everybody in the class. And you see it in things like this. I'm sitting at the back, the teacher will say, what's the capital of Peru? And the student says, Lima. And the teacher says, Lima, well done. What's the capital of Argentina? Buenos Aires, says the student. Buenos Aires, well done. By repeating that answer, you're reducing the requirement of the rest of the class to listen to each other. And teachers say, well, I have to do that because they can't hear it. Right. So let's see that as the problem and solve that problem in a different way. That's why I've written spider's web. I think classes should, as a teacher, you should encourage your class to have relationships with each other. And this is a good example of what I just did then, a factual piece of information. So with that same situation, what's the capital of Peru? Lima, well done. Did you hear that? All the students look at you and say, no, I didn't hear that. Well, ask her because she knows. You know, that's how they start. But eventually they'll get the idea. You heard the information from somebody in the class, that person knows. Tell that person to turn around and tell the rest of the class. Create situations where they are helping and informing each other and you're not the only person there. The first one, you see, it's a bit narcissistic to want the whole class to be waiting on your every word, okay? Maybe better to change that. Okay, I only have one more thing to tell you, then it's time to go make some tea. And it's this one. You need a break. Teachers work too hard. You need a break, okay? And I don't mean a break after the class, I mean a break during the class. And I do not mean a break where you say, open your books at page 10 and do that exercise while I'm sitting here doing nothing. That's okay, sometimes. But what I like to think of, I mentioned in my last talk 2 weeks ago about students taking responsibility for what happens in the classroom. I think really interesting communication can take place in the classroom, which you have started and you can sit back and watch. Now, because this is not a workshop, I can't show you examples of this here. I'm going to give you 5 examples, okay? And these are all activities from this book, which I wrote. Don't worry, I'm not asking you to buy it because it's actually out of print. It's an Oxford book called Drama and Improvisation. What I've done is I've taken all of these activities and I've put them on my blog where you can download them with lots of instructions about how things work. I'll tell you about the first one. Be Someone Else is a very simple activity. You bring a student out to the front. You say, I'm going to ask you 4 very simple questions. What's your name? Where do you come from? Where do you live? And what do you do? Now, in most cases, in the sort of classes I'm talking about, the answer will, apart from the first one, will all be the same. What's your name? Where do you come from? Country. Where do you live? Town. And what do you do? Student. And then you say, now I want you to be someone else. All those answers should be different, not a famous person, and without any preparation. This is important, no preparation at all. You say, the student, what's your name? Juan. Where do you come from? Spain. Where do you live? Barcelona. What do you do? I'm a flamenco dancer. Brilliant. sometimes they've no idea where this stuff came from. And then you say to the students, ask Juan about his life, okay? And then the students ask questions about that. And their homework, they write down what they learned about Juan. And then you've sat down at this point. Juan, you're now the teacher, bring another student out, ask those same 4 questions, the real questions, the pretend question. Anyway, this way you sit down, you have a chance to reflect on what's going on in the classroom. You can make a mental note of things that your students are doing well or not doing too well and need a bit of work. So all these activities here are activities where the students really take over and things happen and you just watch it happening. It's wonderful. Again, as I say, I put it on my blog. It's called 5 Drama Activities. There's my blog reference again. And that is the, I must work out how to do those QR codes, but that's the tiny URL code to access it. Okay, that's everything for today. I hope you're all getting on okay. I'm finding this time quite an interesting time. I'm doing lots of things I wasn't expecting to do. As I told you, I've been tutoring my grandchildren. I'm writing a novel. Some of you already know that. And I'm also agreeing to do various online presentations. I'm going to do something for teachers in Tomsk in Russia in a few weeks' time. And I'm also going to be doing a webinar for IATEFL on the 6th of June. I'll probably be back here with something else before then. I don't know what. I should put something on Facebook telling you what I'm planning to do. Thank you so much for listening. Hope you've enjoyed it. And please, any comments, and please, if you disagree with me, I really want to know. I do not, I have a very thick skin. I don't mind if people disagreeing with my ideas. So please write something on my Facebook page if you disagree or agree with anything you've seen here, okay? Thank you very, very much. Oh, sorry, there's one other thing to tell you is that of all those 5 activities, what time is it? There is a very nice video on YouTube of me doing it with a bunch of primary school teachers in China who were absolutely brilliant. It's really worth seeing that video. They were just wonderful with that activity. Forgot to tell you that. Okay, so it's goodbye. Goodbye from me. Work hard this week. Stay cool, stay safe, stay home, and it's going to finish sometime and we'll be okay. So that's it. Thank you very much. That's my blog again to go and see all those things, and that's my Facebook page. I think you're already all Facebook friends of mine. So I'm going to stop doing this now, and thank you for everything, and take care of yourselves. Okay, whoops, that's all, folks. Bye.